Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the examination of the focused builds focused around the most powerful sets for the Witch Hunter class, the combination of Occultist and Nightblade, the S tier offensive class according to my tier list. Now, right off the top, I just want to get rid of one set right off the top here, Rosin's Torment. Although it does, let me rephrase that, it does enhance certain specific abilities or skills in the class, namely Slail's Witchfire, Whirling Death, and one or two others. The problem here is that this set increases internal trauma damage, which neither of these two classes actually, that's nice, thank you AMD. Neither of these two classes do. Neither of them do internal trauma damage, so this is actually secretly intended for some combination of Soldier and either of the other two. Ideally, the Occultist, the Nightblade, is very limited in its function in this aspect. But I just wanted to throw this out here specifically because I really strongly do not recommend you utilize or focus around this set with the Witch Hunter combination, because it just is not intended for that. Neither of them do internal trauma damage. You'd be wasting a decent amount, because pretty much all the equipment here increases internal trauma damage all down the line, and you're just never going to utilize that in this particular context, because all of the damage conversion for all of these abilities is to chaos damage, not internal trauma. So you're pretty much out of luck if you're hoping to use this with the Witch Hunter class. Is it possible? Yes. Absolutely. Is it recommended? Definitely not. I would just recommend walk away from this one if you're the Witch Hunter combination specifically. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the Vileblade Pact, which is kind of has a similar idea. It's really intended for any combination of the Oathkeeper and either the Occultist and the Nightblade, but we can still actually get this particular set to work really well with the Witch Hunter combination. You will notice Amarasta's Blade Burst becomes, at least to some extent, acid damage, which is fairly important. Hold on to that thought. And Bloody Pox also does a large amount of acid damage, and Possession does more acid damage than the chaos damage. By the way, the chaos damage they're referring to is the flat chaos damage here. 50% of that becomes poison acid. Whoops. And of course, you do have just random chance of decreasing the enemy's pierce and poison acid resistance, which is just really nice. But all of that being said, there is a couple of other things to note. First off, more acid damage on Amarasta's Blade Burst, recharge reduction here, pierce resistance and poison acid resistance as afflicted by Bloody Pox, so as they're dying, they're having their resistances removed, which is really nice. Notice also that, and then we have larger area for Amarasta's Blade Burst. This happens twice. This is on each weapon. And that's about the major points here. I mean, the Venom Spines is just a random extra damage bonus ability thing. It's not really something you need to worry about, but let's actually talk about this rather specifically. So we have Bloody Pox, obviously, which, keep in mind, again, that this is actually doing almost exclusively poison acid damage. This is not actually doing much in the way of other damage types. This is, in fact, not doing vitality. It is instead doing poison acid. And the Nightblade, Amarasta's Blade Burst, is not doing cold, it is doing poison acid. Now, this is a bit unusual for this reason, in that it is a massive increase to your poison acid damage. You would normally be tempted to go Merciless Repertoire, and there is an argument to be made here. Actually, I find Veil of Shadow to be quite a nice skill to put on here. It decreases pierce resistance, cold resistance, which helps Knights chill with a little bit of cold damage. It's doing poison acid resistance goes down even further. This is one option you can use. You could go into Blood of Dreeg, which I'm really fond of in this particular combination, but as nice as that is, you will have noticed throughout this set there was no passive automatic incorporation of dual wielding. There is nothing here that says, oh, you can just passively dual wield. There is nothing of that sort. So you actually have to manually include that, and I usually use Pneumatic Burst, Alright, now if you wanted to go with the full dual wielding instead, that's perfectly fine. That also happens to give you really nice individual single target damage as well, especially if you get all the way up to execution. It's very costly point-wise, because it is literally 56 points, but you can do that and still run Pneumatic Burst or Blood of Dreeg, because with 56 points that still leaves you with enough to grab Blood of Dreeg and a little bit of Aspect of the Guardian, or if you prefer, drop Lethal Assault completely, because I'm actually, hold on, let me double check my memory here, I don't think Lethal Assault is actually enhanced here, it's just Amarastus Blade Burst. Yes. No, Lethal Assault is enhanced right here, so that actually does help. Merciless Repertoire is also enhanced, but frankly, both of these are optional. Even though the set enhances these, this is enhancing your cold acid damage, and while Lethal Assault does do some cold and acid damage and enhances both of those, if you would prefer to instead have Blood of Dreeg, don't be afraid of dropping these. These aren't strictly necessary. Even though it's not particularly a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket, I say that all the time, you're really not, because Dual Blades does a decent amount of cold damage. Again, you can go with Knight's Chill. You can stick with the Lethal Assault Merciless Repertoire combination. They are good, but they're not strictly necessary. Amarastus Blade Burst, Bloody Pox, Possession, of course, for its damage absorption at the very least. These are all necessary, whether you go Pneumatic Burst, Dual Blades, Merciless Repertoire, and Lethal Assault, Veil of Shadow, Knight's Chill. Actually, if you really wanted an effective time, you can run this. You can run Merciless Repertoire, you can run Lethal Assault, you can go into Veil of Shadow, Knight's Chill, and then you can grab Phantasmal Armor, and Soleil's Witchfire if you really felt like it, or you could go into Blood of Dreeg, absolutely, as another heal. That's an option. You could stinking go into Doombolt if you really wanted to. It's a nice splash of Vitality and Chaos damage that you're not going to get in a lot of other places. But the idea here is that you would be doing some combination of cold, poison, acid, and piercing damage. Now, the benefit here comes down to the fact that enemies that are resistant to cold are not usually resistant to poison, acid, and vice versa. There are some exceptions, but they're not that common. For example, a beast hero that is cold resistant would be an exception to this rule, things like that. Regular enemies are not commonly resistant to both of these damage types. What it really comes down to is, do you want to dual wield this because you can, or do you want to go completely skill focused with this, because you can also do that. You could also use Shadow Strike if you really wanted to, for really good individual melee damage, because you're going to have your piercing and cold damage here. You get the Nidal's justifiable ends, you get some poison damage there. Whether or not you go into Nightfall is totally up to you. If you're going to commit this far, you already are enhancing Vitality damage with Possession, you're enhancing cold damage, you're enhancing Frostburn damage. It's kind of like, why not? If you are going to go into Shadow Strike, but Shadow Strike is an excellent response as well. You're usually not going to go into Phantasmal Blades or Ring of Steel, though, because you already have a lot of area damage abilities, so having more isn't really going to help you so much. Kind of the same thing with Dreeg's Evil Eye, unless you don't go into Focused Gaze. If you just go with the straight, regular old Dreeg's Evil Eye, that's a different story altogether. But that's entirely up to you. How you want to deal with groups / individuals is, I mean, you already have group damage well built into it. It just becomes a matter of, do you want to focus on more passive abilities that will help keep you alive, or do you want to focus on the dual blades and do some pretty good single target damage as well? And I didn't pull the points out here because you absolutely can, but I wasn't, if you go all the way to execution, you're going to be leaving it up to the maximum there, so I didn't really play around with that. Just know that you don't necessarily have to full invest into Nightblade here. In fact, often I don't, just as a matter of personal preference. So you do have the Vile Blade Pact, which is very effective. The Demon Slayer's Armament, though, is the most damaging out of these, and there's a simple reason why. This right here, a 7 to 10% reduction to enemies' health from just regular old shooting them. Hello, attack speed. How are you doing today? Now, obviously, beyond that, there are some other things going on here, mostly Phantasmal Blade stuff. This is almost all Phantasmal Blade, as well as some Blade Spirit stuff. But we're going to go all the way up to second right for a hot second here, and Phantasmal Blades, of course, is a nice, delicious time. Go with Frenetic Throw. You're already enhancing Vitality damage, so it's not really a damage loss there. Blade Spirit, of course, is a magical time. And what you want to do here, from here, is entirely up to you. I will usually go... I don't know why I pulled points out of possession. You should always have possession. Doombolt is a great option. Sigil of Consumption also works really well. Or all three if you really want to. You can cram them all in. But you could go Phantasmal Armor. I find myself often going with Anatomy of Murder because it increases that vitality damage, it increases the bleeding damage these do. Bloody Pox is also fantastic here, more reduction to enemy's health, and actually, well, I have a weakness for Bloody Pox in the first place. It's one of my favorite skills, so I do have some bias here. But Bloody Pox plus the pistol of the Demon Slayer's armament set, I can't remember the name of the pistol off the top of my head, what is this called? The Demon Slayer's Life Ender. This Demon Slayer's Life Ender is individual 7 to 10% reduction of the enemy's health each time you shoot, and then you go into Bloody Pox. This is 9 to 13% reduction to enemy's health over the course of 5 seconds. That's for everyone in a group, so I tend to combine the two, but again, I do have a weakness for Bloody Pox, but just keep in mind that it does both vitality and bleeding, so it is going to do respectable amounts of regular damage as well. But that would be... You've got a lot of options here as long as you stay away from, again, pets. You're really not going to be looking to incorporate pets, and obviously the dual wielding is impossible because you don't have a melee weapon in this set. But that's fine. That's usually how I'm going to run that, though. It's a fantastic set. It's very damaging. It's not really so much as good for farming at the Shattered Realm, and that may sound nonsensical to you, but it has no real quick way of getting around, unlike some of the other classes that or some of the other focus builds that I've recommended on this channel. It just doesn't have a lot of ways of moving quickly around the map, so it is a little slow in terms of Shattered Realm. But that's, something, not everything's perfect, but it does hit extremely hard, so do keep that in mind. Next I want to talk about the Deathmarks Shadow. Now this is primarily focused around the idea of using the dual-wielding type abilities, so I'm just going to briefly overview this because you would theoretically be full investing into all of those. That's fantastic, and you usually want to go into Merciless Repertoire as well because it's going to enhance the cold and acid damage that your dual-wielding is going to start doing. Oh look, there's some poison acid here, there's cold here, there's cold here, there's a lot of cold there. Amarast's Blade Burst with Lethal Assault is also a really good response to groups. You could go with Shadow Strike if you were concerned about ranged enemies, or alternatively, you could go into Dreeg's Evil Eye or Bloody Pox. You definitely want to be going into full Slael's Witchfire at minimum, because the higher your attack speed here, the more often you're going to trigger these effects, so you do want max Slael's Witchfire. Whether or not you go into Second Right is entirely up to you. I usually do, because there's just a lot of nice extra damage there. But like I said, I'll usually go into Amarast's Blade Burst here. Merciless Repertoire if you're feeling a little spicy. If you have any leftover points, put them into Phantasmal Armor. There's not really a whole lot to say about this specific build because it does throw so many points into dual wielding. And of course, you've also got Possession from the Occultist just to help you out with your survival. So, if you wanted a healing skill though, you have Blood of Dreeg or alternatively Pneumatic Burst. It's entirely up to which one you feel like using. You could use Dreeg's Evil Eye for ranged if you wanted to. That's also a viable option. You have a lot of options with this one. Again, we're keeping away from pets here, but you can do almost anything you want with this particular setup, with this particular set, and have it be relatively effective. Then we have the Deception of Dreeg. Now, I'm not going to talk about this one a whole lot, because there's actually not much interplay between the Occultist and the Nightblade side of things, and that's primarily because of the chance to pass through enemies. This is pretty significant. You can see the absolutely massive amounts of enhancements to Dreeg's Evil Eye. You've got them absolutely everywhere. This ability will absolutely hit like a steam train, and the general idea is to just max out Dreeg's Evil Eye without using Focus Gaze, so that you can just spam eyeballs through pretty much every enemy there is. And the only reason you would really use Nightblade for is potentially Merciless Repertoire. Maybe you utilize Amarast's Blade Burst for defense purposes. Maybe you have Veil of Shadow for that. Phantasmal Armor, of course, is fairly nice, but that's about all you're really getting here. There's nothing really specifically here that merits the necessarily extreme inclusion here. There's a couple of passive skills and Amarast's Blade Burst that you can fall back on in an hour of need, but for the most part the set focuses around the idea of throwing large quantities of eyeballs and having them pass through enemies and wipe out everything in their path. Which, granted, does work pretty well overall, but it's just, you don't really have a whole lot you can pull out of the Nightblade, and if you're going to be doing the Dreegs, like I said, you're going to be using Blood of Dreeg anyways, so Pneumatic Burst is fairly useless. And you don't need Phantasmal Blades because you're spamming piercing eyeballs at them, so you don't need the range on Phantasmal Blades. Ring of Steel might be effective, especially if you put in Circle of Slaughter instead of Amarastes Blade Burst. That's a viable option. But it's entirely up to you, because basically you're just running with these two skills and Possession, and then just running the rest of this however you particularly feel like. Again, pets aren't really going to help you a whole lot there, but that's just how it is. But I didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time on this, because it doesn't really interplay that well with the Nightblade. Ember's Calling is a bit more of an interesting time, because you'll notice that this is actually a Fire and Chaos damage focused one, with converting Dreeg's Evil Eye and Veil of Shadow into Fire and Chaos damage, and this continues pretty much throughout. You also get extra fire damage on Pneumatic Burst, which is a conversation we're going to have in a hot second anyways. Some flat increases with Fire and Chaos damage on Dreeg's Evil Eye. You have a larger range on Veil of Shadow. It does fire damage instead. It's just a fairly interesting time, so when I run this, I'm usually running Veil of Shadow, obviously, Night's Chill, Pneumatic Burst. No? Alright. I couldn't remember if there was a weapon associated with this. Shadow Dance, and then you're gonna just go whole hog on two things. Dreeg's Evil Eye. I have a weakness for Focused Gaze, so we're gonna pretend that one. And you are also going to be putting your points into the Hellhound. Now you may be thinking, oh, Professor, you're running out of points. Actually, no. I am not even remotely coming close to running out of points. So you have all of these options here. Phantasmal Armor is great. But you see the idea, whatever you spend the rest of your points on is entirely up to you, but you have a lot of options, and this is a really nice surprise strategy, especially if for some reason you're playing PvP or whatever. I don't know if that still technically exists. I haven't tried in years. But it is a nice surprise where you can bust out all of this Fire and Chaos damage out of nowhere. This is the only build that really allows for the use of the Hellhound, and even then it's still not a pet-focused build. You're just throwing them in there to increase your own damage, to do some extra Fire and Chaos damage, which works. But overall, it's a lot of fun to play because it is so different from what you're used to. So if you're tired of the combination, absolutely go with Ember's Calling. It's a fascinating time. Very interesting to play. But well constructed. So the last couple I want to get into is the Korvan Doomfiend, which is kind of like some of the other ones we talked about with the focus on the Poison Acid, but instead you're focusing on Blood of Dreeg and Shadow Strike for the most part. I mean, you can use this with Oathkeeper as well, but for the most part, what you're really looking at here is utilizing Blood of Dreeg with Aspect of the Guardian, and at the very least, Nidal's justifiable ends. You don't necessarily need to go into the Nightfall. I often do, because Merciless Repertoire is really useful here. But you have a nice single target damage here. You've got a self-heal here. Now, at this point, you really just need to choose your ability to deal with groups of enemies. I usually go with Amarastes Blade Burst, especially if I have full Nightfall, because I can enhance the cold and the poison damage here, which is incredibly helpful for this whole ability right here, and does lots of favors for Blood of Dreeg. Beyond that, I mean, you could throw in, if you wanted to, instead Dreeg's Evil Eye. You could go with Phantasmal Armor if you really wanted to. You could go into at least Veil of Shadow. You could do Blade Trap or Blade Barrier. Both are pretty effective as well. But you're really not necessarily going to go into anything else. I believe one of these has, I believe the mask has, yes, automatically dual wields, so you don't need to worry about grabbing a dual wield here. So you don't necessarily need Pneumatic Burst, and in fact with this particular build I don't ever build Pneumatic Burst. Blood of Dreeg is better because it heals more, because you'll actually notice that one of these pieces of equipment, I cannot for the life of me, is it the whole set? Yes, 5% health extra restored on Blood of Dreeg, which you'll notice, by the way, when you max this out, that is actually 33, or exactly 1/3 of your health. So, Blood of Dreeg is actually a much better healing item in this particular situation than Pneumatic Burst because of the enhancements of the set, but you have a lot of different leeway to do whatever you want with. Bloody Pox really works well against groups as well, especially if you decide to go into Anatomy of Murder for kicks. So, there is a lot of options here that are very effective, utilizing poison acid abilities and such. And the last set I wanted to discuss really quickly was just a pair of rings, which is specifically for the Nightblade, and there's not really a whole lot going on here. You just randomly will be doing reduction of enemies' health damage as you wear the 2 rings, plus 3 to Phantasmal Armor and Elemental Awakening. These are just right here. Right, these rings are primarily just intended if you're going to be using some of these abilities anyways, or all of them. Just go on ahead and equip the rings and run with that, because they're very useful. I just wanted to mention them really quick because technically they're a set, but it's not necessarily something you would want to focus a build around. They're just a nice to have if you don't have a set on that increases specifically any of your other abilities. Now, the rings themselves individually enhance a whole lot of stuff, specifically some dual-wielding stuff, so do keep that in mind, that they might not necessarily fit supremely well in with your build, but they're really nice sources of extra damage. They've got, granted, really useless resistances, but the increase in total speed is quite nice, especially in the Shattered Realm, where movement is somewhat more important than usual. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with these sets here. I did kind of partially run through this fairly quick because there is a lot of flexibility with this combination. They share Poison Acid as a damage type. They share Chaos and Vitality to some extent as a common damage type. The Occultist can splash in a little bit of Fire and Lightning. The Nightblade can splash a little bit of Cold if they want, or they can focus on it. Obviously also with Pierce with the Nightblade. But there's just a whole lot of different options, and unlike the previous video where there was a bit more options per build, with this one, because of the uniqueness of the combination, they're a bit more focused in on specific setups, specific skills. I mentioned where I could a lot of the builds, the sets that allow for a lot more personal customization, but just keep in mind that a decent number of this combination's legendary sets kind of railroad you towards somewhat of a heavy, specifically focused build, and a lot of your spare points are going to be used to compensating for the weaknesses of that particular build, whether it's a weakness in being able to deal with individual targets or a weakness in being able to deal with groups. One or the other, you're going to have a problem with a lot of these, as you may have noticed, and most of your spare points are going to be spent dealing with those problems. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe for more delicious analysis videos like this, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, suggestions, or ideas, please leave them down in the comment section below, and thank you all very much for joining me. Have a great 24 hours.